Good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be here on behalf of the GSS Association, sponsor of the Best Sommelier of the World 2023. I also want to express my gratitude and honor for our esteemed guests coming from Japan. Mr. Utsunomiya Sensei, President of GSS. Madame Yuichi. Madame Higuchi. Okay. Coming from UK, Madame Komatsu. Welcome. And of course, everybody knows him, our star Kei-san. For 30 years, he's in the Paris Sommelier Association, the founder of Kura Master in 2017. I'm also honored to be one of the judges for Kura Master since the beginning in 2017. Now, before presenting myself and introducing our topic, I would like to introduce Utsunomiya Sensei, our president, GSS. Thank you very much and welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much for attending today's Sake Masterclass. I'm Hitoshi Utsunomiya, Director of Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association. JSS has been having partnership with UDSF since 2020 and supporting this best sommelier of the world. Finally, JSS joined ASI partnership this year. Let me introduce Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association, JSS, briefly. JSS was founded in 1953. Our members are about 1,400 sake breweries and 300 shochu distilleries from Hokkaido, north area, to Okinawa, south part of Japan. Sake has a more than 1,000 years history as Japan's national drink. Sake is made from rice and has different characteristics from wine. Ms. Scavo will present to you the details. We believe sake can be contributed to world's food culture and world food diversity. Today, I'm sure that a new experience for you. Thank you in advance for your cooperation. Please enjoy this program. Thank you.
Thank you again, Utsunomiya Sensei. And I would like to say that without his precious help, this conference would have been just very, let's say, boring information. I'm so honored to have benefited from your knowledge. Thank you so much. Well, without waiting anymore, you all know me, obviously, Julia Scavo. I am Romanian, as you all know. I am the reigning best sommelier of Romania 2018, the last competition to date. I am also a DipWSET, and I'm an ISI Gold Sommelier. Now, the topic of today's presentation is to take you through a brief history of acidity with sake, because you all know about acidity with wine and how it depends on many parameters. I would simply like you to do something in the same style with sake. And we will go as far as Bodaimoto, in theory as in practical, and we will come to modern era with the Sokuju Motu. I think you're all familiar with this table. I will not explain it too much. I just have chosen the 6 main acids in wine, you all know. You find this in many questions, sometimes passing in the questionnaires for competitions. So, of course, those coming from the grape varieties, like the tartaric, mainly the malic and the citric. I would like to put a point on the TCA cycle. I think it's familiar for you all. It's not about TCA that some know as the trichloranisol. It's something else. It's the Krebs cycle. So when you see it, I think you all know it's that aka citric acid cycle as well, that 8 steps pathway that will degrade some macromolecules like carbohydrates, like glucose, for instance, like fatty acids, like amino acids that need a lot of enzymes, coenzymes, for instance, like the acetyl form of the coenzyme A. So this is the TCA I'm talking about. So they will be actually broken down through this complex 8 pathway step to side products like acids, for instance. Okay, so of course malic that will be degraded by malolactic fermentation in case it's chosen for the wine. And then you will also have some acids like, of course, tartaric that can be used in acidification. Citric is not permitted in the European Union. But then you'll have all the other acids that come afterwards. And we talk about lactic. We sometimes talk a little bit less about that because malolactic is sometimes considered like the lesser brother of the main fermentation. And also the one we barely and scarcely talk about is the succinic. Now you see it will be really reverted with sake, because if in the wine tasting we scarcely mention the succinic, even if it's a very nice acid, a mild, very soft, that gives something sometimes linked to a mineral sensation, sometimes linked to salinity, to sapidity. In sake, you'll see it's slightly reverted. So you will have one of the main acids, the succinic, and of course, you also have the lactic that are quite similar in shares. And then you will have some other acids. We haven't mentioned those with the wine, but you will see that malic, for instance, it's quite important. It comes like all the others from the yeast TCA cycle, but nowadays, since 1993, we also have some malic high-producing yeasts, for instance. You will also notice that acetic, I don't want to really speak about it because, you know, it's linked to spoilage, either in wine or in sake, but it can unfortunately occur. Sometimes in wine it can give a lifted hint, but we really don't want it with sake. Well, pyruvic, fumaric, they're really coming from the TCA cycle, you know, from the hydrogenase and carboxylase of the pyruvic, of the pyruvate, for pyruvic especially. And then you have the citric. I will talk about it a little bit because you have nowadays different strains of koji. You might be familiar with those kojikin from the Shochu, from the spirit industry. They are the Shiro, the white, and the Kuro koji that will definitely bring more citric acidity, and they are mainly used in the Shochu simply because we need a more acidic environment to avoid spoilage. In the case you use those kojikin, you will not have to use a shubo, really, you know. But the topic of nowadays conference being the shubo, and I will go on explaining what the shubo or the mora is, I will just restrain myself not to debating too much on that. So again, thank you very much, Utsunomiya Sensei, for this analysis that you provided us, because this is his entire work, and I'm very happy to benefit from it. Now, since we are talking about acids with sake, you need to quantify that, and we have a scale which is the sando. San means acid, do, it's, let's say, basically a scale. So the sando, it's measured, for those who are familiar to lab analysis, in the same way as for wine. So what happens, we will use a standardized volumetric solution of 0.1 N of sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide is a very high alkali. It's a base that will actually neutralize any acidic environment. So how do you do that? For those who remember this from chemistry classes, you just take a solution of distilled water, let's say like 100 milliliters, put 10 milliliters of sake or wine, in both cases it works. Use a a stirring platter, use a stirring bar, and then drip a little bit of phenolphthalein. It's that nice solution that will turn violet or pink. I really remember that from my lab class. It's very, very nice moment when you start dripping for your burette. You put your hydroxide in the burette and you start dripping. So you measure what is left in your burette. Basically, for sake to reach the neutralization point, you see the neutralization point is different. It's 7.2 as pH in sake, 8.2 for the pH in wine, in your solution, where you put your reactive. So it's the moment when your reactive turns pink or violet for basically 30 seconds and it stays stable. At that moment, you stop dripping and you measure. You'll have like basically 2 milliliters of hydroxide coming from your burette for sake neutralization, and you'll have, let's say, basically like 9 milliliters of hydroxide, sodium hydroxide, for the wine, which by a very simple calculus, using the mass ratio, which is 1 molecule of acid for 2 molecules of base to neutralize, and then using the molecular mass. So that's very important. We are talking about molecular mass of 3 different acids. I will a little bit skip the sulfuric because only the French titrate the wine in sulfuric. But when we talk about wine, we titrate in equivalents of tartaric. So the molecular mass of the tartaric is 150. For the succinic, which is the equivalent we use in titrating for sake, it's 118. So if you use those molecular mass plus the mass ratio and your small calculus, what was in the beginning and what you'll have in the end in your burette, you will obtain your titration. So you will stick to a sando of about 1.2 to 1.5. As for the wine, you will basically go on somewhere around, let's say 5 to 6 if it's a basic, an average white wine in tartaric, or if you want to do it in sulfuric, you will use, of course, the molecular mass of sulfuric. If you want to convert from tartaric to sulfuric, you will use 1.5 conversion. And what's very interesting, you can also, of course, convert by using a 0.83 if you want to convert from sake, so from succinic to sulfuric, and to tartaric, 1.27 basically. We also have extreme sandos ranging from 1 to 2, but most of the sandos, most of the acidity will range between 1.2, 1.7. We'll taste something around 1.7 today. So that's basically 5 times less than what you can get with a wine, okay? So that makes sake a very vulnerable product, vulnerable to spoilage if it's about you, the sommeliers, when you store it, when you sell it, when you keep it in your fridge. So store it accurately in a fridge, 10, 12 maximum degrees. But also, that's a very important issue for the brewer. Hygiene, acidic environment for production, and so on, okay? Well, the second acidity scale we use at sake, it's the amino sando. So we said, do it's scale, san it's acidity, amino, basically it's amino acids. We mainly find the alpha amino acid, which is the glutamic acid. You will be more familiar maybe with its ion form, which is glutamate. So what does glutamate make? It brings the umami taste we are all searching for. That umami taste you all know from your breastfeeding if you had that when you were babies. It's also in the mother's milk. So you have that in sake. When you titrate the amino acid scale, the amino sando, you'll use the same method for those familiar with analyses that are done in the cellar for wine. It's the same formal titration, the Sorensen process, that is used when you want to titrate your YAN, your YAN, your yeast assimilable nitrogen in the cellar. So same procedure. I won't detail on that. It's a titration. It doesn't use the phenolphthalein as a reactive. It will be based on formaldehyde. So basically it's the same procedure. Now the average amino sando scale, it's around 0.9, and it can go as high as 1.7. That means higher umami taste and higher glutamate, while the glutamic acid will vary from 140 to 220 grams per liter. That means you have averagely 5 times more glutamic acid and 5 times more umami in a sake than in an average white wine. So you see, the scales are reverted. 5 times less acidity and 5 times more umami. That's very important, because if you drink white wine, you know that if you chill it, you'll feel it more refreshing, even if your acidity might not be the most assertive possible. While with sake, you will enhance the freshness feeling. You will enhance that refreshing sensation, because you will play on the umami. You will enhance the umami presence when warming a sake. It's exactly the reverse as for the wine. And talking about pH, because refreshing, well, when you don't have the most upfront and assertive acidity, refreshing feeling might come from the pH. You know, in wine, pH from 2.53, 2.93 up to, let's say, 3.84 in some cases. Well, with sake, it will be more a physiological pH that is quite similar to our body's environment pH, while acidities, as I said, it's a scale of 5, of course, from wine to sake. Acidity, it's a matter of trends in wine as well as in sake. You will notice that during the 20th century, we witnessed a process where the acidity was somehow considered as a fault at a certain point. We will talk about the semi-bois ratio at the end of our presentation. When the National Research Institute for Brewing and the National Bank for Yeast was created in the beginning of the 19th century, and the first yeasts were issued by 1906, they were producing acidity. Now, when we reached the ginjo boom, the beginning of the ginjo boom, which is situated in the early 60s, but then was really at its top in the 80s, we started discovering aromatic yeasts that were producing less acidity as well. One of the best known, which actually made a rupture in this trend of acidities, was the number 9, the Kumamoto, one of the best recipes for obtaining medal sakes in competitions. So at that point, when the Kumamoto was discovered, there was a trend change that considered acidity to be something faulty. Now we really find out there's a kind of increasing interest and a rising trend in categories like Kimoto or Yamahai. And who knows, maybe Boraimoto will come back. We'll have some surprises a little bit later. We also talked about those strains of koji, also talked about that malic producing yeast discovered in the 1993s. So that means that people in the industry are turning again to this nice, refreshing acidity that we are looking for in the sake. Well, we said that malolactic fermentation, as sommeliers, you might know a lot of strains of yeasts, but how many strains of bacteria do you really know? Do you really focus on what do they do on wine, besides simply providing a certain stability, certain off products and aromas, and giving a little bit of a decrease in the acidity of the wine? Well, not exactly. I think when we go to a winery, we mainly ask about the yeast, generally speaking. Well, malolactic and bacterial life, it's tremendously important in wine as in sake. And I think in sake, we even speak less about lactic fermentation, we call it a lactic fermentation, than in wine. So what's a lactic fermentation? I only put down 2 of the reactions that form the lactic fermentation, meaningly the homolactic and the heterolactic fermentations. Both will imply the use of bacilli. So you'll have the Lactobacillus sakei, not NA, the sake for the first one, and you'll have mostly the Leuconostoc mesenteroides for the second one. So you can notice there is a small change because there's a little bit of ethanol with a heterolactic. You will see the heterolactic, especially with the Boraimoto, a little bit later, and you see that they only produce 2 molecules of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. What's ATP? ATP is food for yeast. So that's very important to produce a solid environment and to feed those yeasts. Similar to wine that has, where the yeast in this time, not the bacilli, not the bacteria, the yeast have two types of reaction. One being the respiration. So through the respiration, the yeast, in the presence of oxygen, will actually breathe and will produce a lot of ATP. That means that when the anaerobic phase will occur, it will have enough food to eat. And then it will go to fermentation, the basic, that simple equation, which is actually 10 steps or 8 to 10 steps equation, actually is the Krebs cycle we mentioned a little bit previously. Now, when it comes for the bacterial, that lactate fermentation with sake, you will notice that you have a third process, which we scarcely mention. This third process being respiration. And in that case, and you will see it with Kimoto, in that case, the bacteria, which can be different strains of nitrate-reducing bacteria. This bacteria would actually use nitrate and will transform this nitrate to nitrite, and further on to nitrous acid. And nitrous acid is a poison. It's poisoning all the unsolid or unwanted yeasts, especially. So you know, yeasts are very, they are very resistant and tolerant to acidity. Bacteria aren't, but some yeasts will not actually tolerate or resist some acids like the nitrous acid and the nitrate. So this is what we are aiming when having that respiration process, which can be enhanced by using a potassium kalium nitrate. We will talk about that later on. So keep in mind those two equations, and Lactobacillus sakei and the Leuconostoc mesenteroides, because you will hear them later on. Now let's start our brief history, since the most historical Shubo until the, I would say, the most modern one, because now you have even more modern stuff using liquefied matter. We talked about those strains of Shiro and Kurokoji, so I will stop to a very modern, but still it's the traditional modern Sokuju. Now, since I mentioned the word Shubo, what's Shubo? Shubo, it's the mother culture. Shubo or moto, it's that starter, that fermentation starter. You know, in all fermentations, you aim to have a starter, because if you just use a little bit of the foam of your fermenting process, or already fermenting one, you won't have consistency. So people realized, especially in sake by the 12th century and continuously developing it through the 14th century, that using a kind of starter would be very helpful for consistency. So for sake nowadays, a shubo, it's actually formed from rice, the koji, the kome koji actually, the yeast and the water. Bear in mind that in those times, yeasts were indigenous yeasts, so we didn't have that bank of yeasts from the beginning of the 19th century. Now you have the Kyokai Kobo, which are the labelized yeasts for sake, and also the koji. It's starting, let's say, by that time in the 12th century, before koji entered from China at the end of the first millennia. What did people do? Somebody knows? The kuchikame no sake. That means chewing and spitting it. That was reserved to virgins, of course. But forget about it. We move on to the qualities of shubo. So shubo needs to be acidic. What did I say? Yeasts kind of resist and tolerate acidity, while bacteria don't. So what do we want? We want the good guys. We want the yeasts. And since at that time, yeasts were coming from the environment and were not added by the toji, well, we needed the good, solid ones. We wanted to get rid of the bad guys, and we wanted to get rid of those who are not that solid. So in that case, what can we do? Acid. We said sake, it's not the most acid environment. Wine is even more acidic than it is, sake. Well, at that moment, people couldn't go at the shop and buy lactic acid. Imagine the samurais, they didn't know that mean, to go, and lactic acid in tubes didn't exist at that moment. So what did they do? Because we're talking about samurai. Samurai, it's the Edo period when kimoto was actually done. What did they do? They encouraged the production of mainly lactic acid, by the means of good guys and good bacteria strains. And we will see how they actually did. And that eventually encouraged actually not only the selection of the best yeast strain, but also encouraged the selection of those yeasts that could produce less funky aromas. In the beginning, sake was rather funky. We moved on to something purer, the ki. Ki means pure, true. And nowadays, we really look for something that is completely pure and flawless. So, this being said, tasting will start in a couple of minutes, and we go to Bodaimoto. Bodaimoto, also called Mizumoto. Mizu is water. We will see why it's called Mizumoto as well. So I have the pictograms for those interested. This is the old school shubo. It's dating back to Buddhism. Remember that Cistercian monks in Europe were those who had the whole knowledge about winemaking by those periods. Remember the masterclass from this morning? Ora e labora. So they just worked and prayed. Buddhists were those who had all the savoir-faire, all the know-how about sake. So in that time, in the Shoryakuji temple in Nara, because Nara was the center of the sake industry at the time, they discovered something very interesting. I'll make a parallel with beer. You all know the Seine Valley in Brussels. What happens there? Bacteria come from the valley, and yeast come from the valley, like Brettanomyces, brucellosis, and other bacteria, because that flow of the river with the humidity and ventilation bring all those elements to the breweries like Cantillon and many others in the lambic production. Samely with sake. In this part of Nara, in the Shoryakuji temple, there was a classic environment with ventilation, with a lot of humidity coming from water creeks that brought in not Brettanomyces and other bad bacteria like in the production of lambic, but good guys like the Leuconostoc mesenteritis. And the monks realized they could brew sake all along the year. You know that until the temperature control arrived with sake, sake tended to be brewed only in cool periods, only in winter. Well, now we can do it all along the year because we have temperature control, but still it's a tradition for winter time. Now these Buddhist monks actually put their shubo outside at warm temperature and encouraged those mesenteritis, those Leuconostoc mesenteritis to come into the shubo. What did they do? They used only rice, not koji in the beginning. The rice, maybe a little bit of steamed rice, because steamed rice hydrolyzes better the starch into the water, and then they just waited for a couple of days, 3 to 8 days, so that those bacteria come in and definitely do a very interesting process. I mentioned there is no koji, so there's nobody there to transform your starch to glucose. What happens? Leuconostoc mesenteritis has the ability to produce amylolytic enzymes, one of them being the glucosidase. Glucosidase will go into the starch that has been little by little hydrolyzed because there is a little bit of steamed rice, and then it will transform that starch into glucose available further on for other elements like yeast. So this will take a couple of days, I said 3 to 8 days mainly, until we obtain that soyashi mizu. Soyashi mizu is a soured water. It's a soured water because of the lactic bacteria. The lactic bacteria will have those amylolytic properties, but meanwhile, what happens? I will just go back to my lactic fermentation. So what happens when you have Leuconostoc mesenteritis and you have some glucose, then you will produce lactic acid, a little bit of ethanol, and a little bit of carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide actually gave the monks the indication that everything was going okay, and they could obtain their soyashi mizu. When they saw the cloud of carbon dioxide, they could filter their soyashi mizu, the soured water. Then the residual rice, would be finally steamed, completely steamed. Then they will put a koji, the kome koji inside. Well, nowadays we can put the yeast, the kobo, but at that time they were waiting for the yeast coming from the environment in their brewery. And then that's the Borai Moto. In, let's say, about another 6 days, your starter will be kind of finished. This was good because it was happening in warm climate, in warm condition during your summer, for instance, and it's quite short. It was quite reliable on for that period, even though it was quite funky, and a lot of specialists would say it smells like baby vomit. Well, let's say it should smell like something like cheese rind, like yogurt. Ours today, because now let's taste the product we have the chance to have here. You have the chance to taste the only commercial Borai Moto on the market. So the Tsuji Honten. Now we are not in Nara. You can see that we are not in Nara. You are actually in Okayama. So you see that on the map. Why? Because Tsuji Honten wanted to recreate the process of Borai Moto, which is very old, as we mentioned, and they also are in the land where Omachi rice was born. Omachi is the grandfather of all the rices. It's the old strain, original strain. Basically, all the strains of rice you have nowadays are hybrids. All we taste then are actually crossed and hybrided and bred from other varieties based on Omachi in the beginning. So Omachi was actually discovered to have been occurred there in 1859, so which explains actually the name of your cuvée. All the brewery uses only 100% of Omachi, and they are now at 40% of the brewing process in Borai Moto style, tending to go to a pure Borai Moto 100% for all their cuvée. So let's take a taste of it. So you will notice that it's not what I promised to you, like really cheesy and funky, just because they use the 1401 Kobo, Kyokai Kobo, which is a very modern, non-foaming. When you have the 01, it's a non-foaming yeast, and you will see that really creates something more consistent and more reliable on for tasting. Okay, so in this case, you really have aromas, quite aromatic characters like orchard fruit. You even have something a little bit exotic. There is lactic hints. You have that, of course, knowing it's a Borai Moto, I think we are all influenced, but there is something lactic. It goes like, like fruity yogurt. There's something floral as well. It's very pleasant, and I think the role of the 1401 yeast, it's major here. But where is really a Borai Moto is on the palate, where we really feel the Borai Moto. I think you're all familiar to sake tasting, and sake, it's round and very pleasant just because its acidity, it's low, but it can have that vibrancy and refreshing fruity taste in modern categories. Here you have something that has a really refreshing style, even if the acidity is of course lower than the wine. We cannot say it's as high as an acidity in wine. It's refreshing, it gives that crisp, you have the texture that comes along, and those lactic notes that really indicate you it's definitely a Borai Moto. And I was very surprised because, yeah, I was expecting Borai Moto to be something really what you might expect with natural wine, for instance. But yeah, it's very pure, it's very clean, of course, and yeah, real pleasure to use it in many situations. Why it's interesting to have this acidity with sake, because of course acidity will be doubled here by umami. You have a nice umami taste, that roundness, that density of texture, and you can of course pair it with let's say cheeses. That will be really fantastic to have that balance of acidity and umami, and you can even serve it a little bit warmer, and that will even enhance the freshness, pushing a little bit the aromas yeah, I think that's a very interesting experience, and you will compare. So keep in mind that in the end, you can compare the acidity from all these 5 glasses. That's very interesting to have a whole picture of the acidities. Okay, so next step will be Kimoto. Kimoto, as I said, ki from Kimoro means pure or true. That means it should be less funky than the Bodaimoto. Well, but since we had a very pure and very lovely scented Bodaimoto, we will find that Kimoto, it's actually a little bit more traditional, I would say, in style, but I won't reveal more, we will taste it. What happens with a Kimoto? Kimoto, it's actually occurring the first time in the Nara area, in Hyogo. Hyogo, it's the area you all know for the Yamada Nishiki. And Nara, it's one of, the Nara Gogo, it's one of the GIs nowadays. It's mentioned at the Edo period. So in the 16th century, we already have mentions about Kimoto. It's the samurai sake, as we can say, and actually it was perpetuated for about 300 years because Japan was in isolation, as you know. Until the Meiji period, it was completely isolated. And people used to use that labor-intensive method, which you might see. I will just go back to this picture. So you see this on a lot of pictures, a lot of lithographies, a lot of drawings, even from that period. People that are actually pounding, grounding the rice in hingares, in those tubes. So it's very labor intensive. You need to do it, let's say, every 15 minutes. You move to another hingari, and 2 to 3 people are actually pounding inside. That kind of recall you what happens with food trading methods in the Douro for vintage. They are also singing songs, just like people do it in the Douro when they are singing the Corta della Garish. It's the same style because you need to keep the rhythm and do it very accurately, very properly. You do it with kind of poles which are called gai, and they are actually finished with a kind of flat block so that it really pans the rice accurately. In the beginning, they used to do it by feet. So it was very harsh because we didn't have any polishing machine at that time, and the rice was what we call a genmai. So it was a very, very harsh and integral brown rice with that gen, with that kind of capsule encompassing it. So the yama oroshe, it's a poetical way to say mototsuri. Mototsuri means actually pounding, grinding the rice. But yama oroshi, it's very poetic, like many words in Japanese. That means destroying the mountain. That mountain of rice will be actually destroyed by this procedure. Well, beside the poetical implication, what happens there is that since they are not polishing the rice at that moment, the rice was very few polished, they thought that koji would penetrate better the rice. Now we polish, we know that koji doesn't need to be really pushed into the rice to penetrate, because it will definitely penetrate due to temperature and hygrometry, but at the time people thought it would really work like this. So they are doing this. We will see the whole procedure, and we will actually influence on different strains of bacteria, especially those nitrate reducing bacteria, but also some good lactic bacteria that will come in and provide acidity. It's a long method. Nowadays, the sokuju takes like 2 weeks. At that time, it was up to 1 month, and it's still 1 month if you want to do it now. So it's what we call long method for sake production. So this is how it works. The first day, you put the komekoji. So at that time, they already had the koji. You put your komekoji around 15. Nowadays, in the shubos, you can put as much as 30% of komekoji, while in your moromi, you'll stick to about 20%. But at the time, it was like 50% of komekoji, then half and half water and rice. You can decide to start with 2 elements and add the third one afterwards. But this is mainly used with the next procedure we will talk about. Okay, so I will skip that. Let's say we put everything together, even if we start with 2 elements and then put the second one. We need to start at a very low temperature. 6 to 7. Why? Because otherwise all the bad guys are getting in. So that was a very big challenge at the moment, because they didn't have any temperature-controlled breweries. Of course, they did it during winter time, not during the warm periods. In that case, they had to control the temperature in each hengari, or in the shubo, definitely. How did they do that? They had a daki. A daki, it's like a bucket. It was made of wood at the time. Now they still use the daki. A daki, it's made in stainless steel nowadays. And they put ice inside, and they put a bucket in the hengari. Otherwise, you can use jackets and other temperature control installations that you can have nowadays, as for wine, for instance. Then what happens the second day? The second day is the grinding, is that working hard, working in a labor-intensive period where 2 or 3 people are actually mixing and grinding the rice in each hengari. On the third day, they are mixing all the hengari, and they are putting them in the shubo. They combine all these tubes. The temperature should be very low at that moment until the nitrate-reducing bacteria come in. You can enhance nitrate-reducing bacteria to work by using the potassium nitrate, which it's actually very easy to obtain even at the time, because it's used by using urine, for instance. It's what we call in French the salpêtre. And that will be very important, because at that time, a lot of unwanted yeasts like Pichia, like Candida mycoderma, you know, from the wine, they will be forming the film on the top of the shubo, and that's absolutely unwanted. So your nitrate will be degraded to nitrate and will definitely be transformed into nitrous acid, and that rays of nitrous acid will poison those Pichia and Candida mycoderma. At that moment, the 5th day, you will need to play on temperature a lot. So that Daki method, the Daki method will be very important. They will do a zigzag continuous rising of the temperature by putting Daki with ice, Daki with hot water, and so on. So that will be really doing a zigzag of the temperature that will be continuously, discontinuously actually rising. At the 14 days, either you inoculate your yeast nowadays, or you wait for those goodies to come in, just because meanwhile Lactobacillus sake or Leuconostoc mesenteritidis come into the play and will create the lactic acid. You'll have that rise in nitrous acid, then the nitrous acid will fall down, then the lactic acid will go up, and by the 14th day you will either have inoculation naturally from the environment, or you inoculate with your own yeast. Then there is another phase. You see, until that moment, you have 2 weeks. That means your sokuju nowadays is as short as that. Everything is done in those 2 weeks. But with your kimoto, you need to wait another 14 days because at that moment, you need to really select the best yeast from the environment. There might come some unwanted, some, let's say, less solid yeast, and you really need to be sure that those yeasts that, for instance, here can make only lactic aromas will also provide you some consistent aromas and a very consistent fermentation. So that happens, let's say, by the 19th day, you'll start worming your shubo, and you'll worm it using, you'll actually put it again in Hungary because it's a little bit easier to have small tubes, and you will start actually raising the temperature using again those Daki method. Okay, so this is how it is actually spread in very traditional terminology. You can take pictures with courtesy of GSS. This is actually the classic terms until the wake will be again spread into different tubes, and then actually the temperature will be at its higher point, and then you need to chill it down so that further on you need to use it in the moromi process, so in your mashing process. Okay, so let's now taste the Urakatsumi Kimoto. The kyoke means wood matured. Traditionally, it's cedar, but it's not mentioned to be a taruzake. It comes from the Miyagi prefecture. It's a very local variety of rice, the Toyo Nishiki, polished at 70%, which makes it a Jumai, and it's a Kimoto with 15 degrees of ABV. Now you will see that it looks slightly more traditional than the previous one, because you'll have some dried fruit notes like walnuts, like even that green peel of the walnut coming in. Nice spiciness like white pepper, cardamom. And you won't have those aromatic compounds. You'll be more restrained in aromas, and you'll have more of the apple compote than really apple estery notes. And as you put it on your palate, so that will be, let's say, moderately high, but very fresh, crunchy acidity that comes on your palate. It's dry and very silky, but it becomes denser and denser with concentration, with, again, those notes that are slightly bitter in a very nice way, recalling walnut peel, recalling a lot of spiciness, zestiness, something like nigami sensation, nicely bittery on the finish, and very long on that apple compote and that dried fruit with spiciness. So a really lovely sake for gastronomy. I would even recommend it for meat, like poultry, for instance. That would be fantastic with guinea fowl. If you put almond or nutty butter under the skin, just slow cook it, and with nice and sweet purees that will be backed by this beautiful acidity. Great. So let's go on to Yamahai. Well, surprise. In the 1909, a lot of things happened in Japan. We mentioned that time the creation of the National Institute for Research in Brewing. We also mentioned that the first yeasts were coming in little by little, starting with that period. In the 30s, you'll even have the polishing machine, but we're not already there. So what happens? Kinshiro Kagi discovered that what the guys did for 300 years was actually useless. So imagine, from father to son, they transmitted it. You have to do the yama oroshi every day, pounding, pounding, pounding. Well, now it's the yama oroshi haishi. So no more yama oroshi, no more destroying the mountain. That means, in a very short way, yama hai, from yama oroshi haishi. Now, Yamahai was very similar to Kimoro. What differs is that since you don't pound the rice, you might take care that your koji really penetrates into the rice. And it does, but at that moment, they actually didn't really understand all the procedure, and polishing machine was not really new, so that your rice was still very unpolished at the time. So as they wanted to take care that the koji penetrated all the rice in your shubo, they will only start with 2 elements, and then they will add the third one. So they will mix, for instance, water and koji, so that koji will start extracting its enzymes that are most of them amylolytic, like alpha amylase, for instance. You also have some peptidas, you also have some protease enzymes. Everything will get into your water. And you'll make the koji mizo. So that means the water with koji. You can also choose to mix your rice, for instance, in the water, so that you start hydrolyzing your starch, and then you add your koji that will come just to eat to degrade actually the starch in a very easy way. You can notice that temperature can be a little bit higher than for Kimoto, 8 to 10, simply because you will actually control this process by using, for instance, this mix of koji miso in the beginning. And then you will see that without grounding it, without pounding it, you will have to do a kind of pumping over. So pumping over actually will stimulate oxygen production. The oxygen is good in the respiration. So what happens when all those bacteria can breathe, can do the respiration, well, they will be at ease to degrade actually everything that is nitrate into nitrate and then into nitrous acid, for instance, that is killing and poisoning everything that is bad guys like Pichia and Candida. So then we will do, just like for the Kimura, we will blend everything together in the shubo, and we will also use the daki. We will also change the temperatures in a zigzag, discontinuous way, and of course, a lot of other bacteria come in, the Lactobacillus sake, the Leuconostoc mesenteroides. Each one will bring its contribution to creating more and more acid, lactic acid especially. At the 14th day, you will do the yeast inoculation, and just like for the Kimura, and I will show this on the next slide, you will also do your wake, so you will also spread again your shubo so that you will control better the temperature. You will start selecting the best and most solid yeast, so that in the end, when you have your population, and you will feel that because it will start smelling a little bit estery, you will have a little bit of carboat, you'll have a little bit of carboatedityl, especially some isoamyl acetates and other esters coming from yeast either inoculated by yourself or that are coming from the environment. At that time, actually, you will chill everything down so that you can use it for your morome. So very similar. By tasting, it's very difficult to say if it's a Yamahai or a Kimura, personally. You have acidity, you have something lactic there, you have a traditional style. It's basically more obvious to use it with Junmai, even if you can use any polish ratio you want. So it's not, what I want you to know is that, okay, we used Junmai because we wanted to stay on a Junmai level and to have a consistency of our tasting. But of course, all these methods can be done nowadays with any polishing rate you want. But since they are traditional methods, it's slightly, I'd say, unusual to really want to polish to extreme and then practice a Kimura or Yamahai, though it exists. Okay, so now let's go to your next sake. So this comes from Ishikawa Prefecture. You can see that on your map. It's Goyaku Mangoku. Goyaku Mangoku, it's a quite familiar rice variety. It's very similar in terms of use to Yamada Nishiki, though it's slightly more productive and it gives a certain mouthfeel to your palate. The grains are, let's say, quite similar in terms of their weight. Now this is a pure Yamahai with 16% of alcohol per volume. I think it's slightly aged because you can notice it by the goldish color. You have those nice goldish hues. And that is confirmed on the palate, so I think we cannot go up to saying it's a koshu, but it's kind of a maybe a juku, say, kind of, a little bit aged sake, because you already have that honey-scented and baked apple banana peel as well coming there. A little bit of lactic aromas that are defining the Yamahai method. You have that buttery, that lactic aroma coming there. And let's see it on the palate. Yeah, that's definitely a very serious palate, that it's dry and very worming with layers of texture, with a nice and quite linear acidity that comes there and cuts through this bold and slightly grainy texture. You feel something very grainy on the back palate, like zest, like candied zest. It comes with spiciness, something recalling cardamom again, like cumin. There is honey, toasted almond, nice bitterness. So again, a very gastronomic sake that will be, I believe, excellent for lobsters or spiny lobsters. If you make a creamy sauce, if you add some spices, you make it with some oriental spices or in Armorican style, I think that would definitely be excellent. Or a curry, a lobster curry, that would be another good idea, because even if you have a little bit of alcohol, you have enough texture and boldness in palate just to go and counterbalance all those nice warming spices, and then you come with that mellowness that will really surround that. Lovely gastronomic sake. And this one, I think, if you keep it in your fridge, that will be really good for a couple of weeks. It won't fade, you know, like a Junmai Ginjo or a Dai Ginjo. And that's really a sake for sommeliers who want to sell it by the glass. Okay, so we are getting closer to our era, the Sokuju moto or Sokuju Shubo method. And that's what you most of the time see if you go to Japan and visit brewers, because 90% of the sakes are made using this method. To give you an idea, true Kimoto, it's only about 1% of what you find on the market. But let's say basically 10% of what you can find, it's more or less about traditional methods, while the Sokuju and modern shubos are 90% of the market. Sokuju, the quick fermenting method. So it arrives there when, you know, we are in the Meiji period, we are opening towards the world, and a gentleman called Eda Kamajiro finally discovered that you don't have to wait days and days for the lactic acid to be produced. They now had, you know, chemistry was developed. They now had lactic acid available. So he just had to buy that lactic acid and put it in his shubo. So that means you just add like 0.65% of lactic acid. It will make your pH go as down as 3.5, 3.8. We are around pHs that you can encounter with wine. And that's fantastic, because this will actually select your environment. And you'll have less labor to do. So how exactly it works? That's the traditional shubo. You mix water, you mix your rice, you mix your komekoji in either way you want. We normally have like 30% now of komekoji used in that shubo. And then you'll just do a very modern kumikake pumping over in the day 2. So now they really have vats with pumping over installations, just like in wine. As you actually, I forgot to say, of course, obviously, you'll put your lactic acid inside. So that means your environment is secured. And what happens? Your temperature control nowadays is quite modern. You'll have a nice zigzag temperature that will actually rise continuously until the yeast population is established. The alcohol will start rising, temperature rises, your yeast are perfectly selected, and then you can chill it down and add it to your morome in the end. So it's basically what you can find in any known sake brewery in Japan, and it takes half of the time than the traditional methods. And it prevents from spoilage, giving more consistency. Now this is how it actually happens, because I just wanted to make it shorter, but you have a lot of steps in this pathway until they can eventually use it. Yes. Now we will have just one consideration to say about the seimai-buai, because we have 2 sakes. We will taste them in parallel. So you will have actually considerations about seimai-buai when it comes to increasing, or to lowering the acidity, or increasing. If you polish less, of course, you will notice that your sake will be a little bit more acidic. If you polish more, as it happens most of the time nowadays, you will tend to have less acidity, and you'll tend to have a softer palate with, let's say, more aromatics, as you know, and less umami. Okay, so seimai-buai, or the polishing rate, is very important as well in the acidity. Okay, so now let's taste the last 2 sakes. You will have the Bijofu, the Tokubetsu Junmai. So I recall you that the Tokubetsu, it's 60%. So even if it's a junmai, you have to have a 60%. It's actually that you are going into the ginjo area, but you're not really wanting those ginjo aromas. You will work in a different style, not to have that much of the ginjo features. Okay, so you have anyway a little bit of aromas of ginjoka, slightly going towards notes of banana, but there is still a very ricey character, some confectionery there, and you can see how soft the acidity becomes, how creamy the palate is, and how you're going towards something a little bit more ricey but also fruity, with a nice smooth alcohol but less umami and tinged with a nice zesty finish. So this is, let's say, something in between starters and aperitif, and that's a pure sokuju. I wanted to reflect again a junmai, but in a sokuju style. And then you can compare it with the last one, which is actually to reflect how we can have a lower polishing rate, actually a higher polishing rate with 55% on Hatan Nishiki. Hatan Nishiki, it's one of those hybrids from the Hatan spectrum in Hiroshima Prefecture. And well, even if you are at 55 polishing rate, you have something that is quite smooth, that will be a little bit herbal, something like cucumber and other herbal notes, slightly floral as well, and it's very, it's more restrained, I would say, even if the tokubetsu was just a tokubetsu junmai. However, it's the palate that will indicate you the polishing rate is 55. You have something that it's really soft and rounded up with a nice spicy character coming from the alcohol, because there is a little bit less umami and less acidity to counterbalance it. It makes it softer, and you'll have all that explosion of flavors on the palate, and it's finishing with a nice rich character. Blossomy, slightly herbal again. And I think this, if you serve it chilled, now of course we're in the end, we are really getting very close to our end of the masterclass, but of course if you taste those two in a slightly chilled style, that will enhance a little bit that softness without getting too much of the umami and the acidity. Okay, so that is fantastic. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions. We will ask you to ask your questions later, actually, because we are actually running out of time, and Utsunomiya Sensei and I will be very glad to answer your questions. You can come in private. Questions, and thank you again.
So thank you very much for this fantastic experience. Very, very technical, very precise, as usual with Julia. I remind you, tomorrow at 10 for the last masterclass. Okay, remember that. And after the masterclass, the Macallan masterclass, you have a short time to prepare to go to the arena. You have to prepare your jacket, your dress for tomorrow. You have to eat something quickly. It's not exactly like usual. It's just a fingerful for tomorrow. And after that, you have different buses to go to the arena. Okay? You have the information tomorrow, more precise, but the spirit is here. Okay? So thank you so much again for this fantastic masterclasses. Thank you to you Thank you very much to the volunteer, David and his team. Please applause, a big applause for today again. And for the week, fantastic week. Really, really, with the heart of together. I remind you also, you have a few minutes before the opening of Bar des Sommeliers. It's a very important information for tonight. And after the dinner, you have the free dinner, but you are very welcome, and you are invited to come back for the last Bar des Sommeliers of this week, because tomorrow we'll be on the arena for the show and for the event, for the final in apotheose, like we say in French. Thank you so much. You have a question? Yes, please. Yes, dress code for the candidate. Your job. You like a sommelier dress. Yes, for the picture. It's very, very important. Okay, and it is yes, all candidate. It's better for the picture. Okay, and for the other, it's normally black tie, but it's a very elegant dress. That's fine also, but if you have a smoking or black tie, it's better for tomorrow. Okay? Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy your time in Paris, and thank you so much.